My name is Brooke Lehman. I live in New York City and I'm 37. I'll just start with, I became involved specifically in the anti-globalization movement when it was sort of in its nascent form in the United States. I've been doing other kinds of organizing before then, but was involved in Reclaim the Streets in the late 90s in New York City. And then when I heard that the World Trade Organization was going to be in Seattle, really jumped on board as early as I could and went out there and started organizing, in part because I felt like what was so interesting about the World Trade Organization, aside from the fact that it was really essentially pissing off such a wide swath of movements, the way that it was structured to me was really emblematic of sort of a pinnacle consolidation of power. It to me represented, oh goodness, sort of the end of a logic around capitalism and the usurping of this sort of shell of democracy that people still believe around the nation state. And so, and really taking it to the ultimate farcical point. So I was very interested in going out and really using the World Trade Organization to both show the direction that capitalism was ultimately heading. And I don't think that the World Trade Organization actually succeeded in what it was trying to do, which was essentially make nation states unnecessary and create a global trade court that really only regarded capitalism as important in terms of not really requiring the nation state as a go-between. That's what the Multilateral Agreement on Investments was attempting to do, and that's what the World Trade Organization was attempting to do, and didn't get that far because of such an enormous outcry, both in terms of direct action mobilizations and also a lot of the other nation states, smaller nation states that were getting a raw end of the deal. But my interest was in looking at this tremendously anti-democratic organization. Do you want me to get rid of the dogs?
It'd be helpful.
Okay.
But, is that possible?
I can keep talking, and you want to just throw them downstairs? They'll if you just, even just taking one of them, they'll follow you. Go, Snook. Go. Ugh. The other option, if you just give me Snooker, she'll sit next to me. Is that going to make you itch? Come here. I'm just going to sit with her and hold her with one hand.
Okay. So we'll continue.
No, you don't get to look up there. Sit down. Good girl. So, looking at a tremendously anti-democratic organization and countering it with the politics of our movement, which I think were innovative in an interesting way in really proliferating a different kind of knowledge around democracy and what's possible. That's not to say we were inventing the forms of democratic practice that we were utilizing, but I think we succeeded in broadening the usage and understanding and really creating a language that that was international. Certainly the roots of the types of democratic organizing that we were using come from movements in the U.S. like the anti-nuclear movement. The Clamshell Alliance used spokes council models, had roots in Quaker town meetings, had roots in different Native American forms of democracy, had roots in the Iberian Anarchist Federation. So it was sort of a culling of a lot of different forms of knowledge, and using that knowledge to create massive forms of democratic decision making that were not cumbersome, that actually had a lot of fluidity. We're not perfect, but we were able to sometimes have thousands of people, even people that weren't necessarily activists, that didn't have a lot of experience in democratic organizing, which is something that we certainly don't have a lot of experience in by design, probably, in the United States. Our schools don't teach it. We're not taught to truly be citizens. We're taught to be cogs in a capitalist framework. And most people have never had an experience of actually being involved in a truly democratic process beyond maybe voting for a class president or voting for an actual president, but certainly not in creating the options and creating the ideas in a collective and egalitarian way to then collectively come to consensus around. So the term prefigurative politics was a term that we used a lot, which was essentially meaning that we were attempting to prefigure the world that we wanted to create in the way that we were organizing. And that had a lot to do with the actual structure of decision making. The term spokes council was the term that we used for the style of organizing that we used in creating mass direct action. And we used it in a number of direct actions. And the term spokes council comes from the idea of mimicking the spokes of a wheel. And we would have people come to those actions in affinity groups or help people find affinity groups, which are groups that they either had tactical or political affinity with, or social affinity. And rather than having a traditional representative structure where you would pick one person and they would make decisions based on their own judgment, and if you didn't like their decisions, you lived with them, and creating sort of a class of delegates that would make decisions, and your only recourse was maybe recalling them whenever that was appropriate. The notion of a spokes council offered for all of the people involved to have active participation in decision making without having a gigantic room also of a million voices and sort of a chaotic situation where you've got 1,000 people trying to speak and express their opinions. We would have people in their affinity groups, and the spokespeople, which usually were totally rotational. Sometimes in the middle of a meeting you could change a spokesperson. They could be recalled if they weren't doing a good job, if they got tired, if they didn't want to be the spokes anymore. It didn't really matter because they weren't making the decision. They would sit in an inner circle, and their affinity group would sit directly behind them. So the idea is that affinity groups would be fanning out like the spokes on a wheel around this inner circle of spokespeople. And when a decision needed to be made, the spokesperson would actually turn around, consult with their entire affinity group, decide what it was that the affinity group as a whole was comfortable with, and then essentially just report back to the spokes council what their affinity group was feeling, which was really interesting in a lot of respects. One, it allowed for a great number of people to really be invested and engaged in the decision making. It also required that an affinity group really feel strongly about a position before their spokesperson brought it forth to the group. So you didn't have a situation where one person in that affinity group maybe had, sort of a wild idea. It required that they at least had the support of the rest of their affinity group, and that their affinity group came to consensus around it before they brought it to the larger whole. And so it creates a situation where you have a lot more well-formulated thinking going into the process before you've got the ear of 1,000 people. And that was really interesting and really helpful, and I think it allowed for people to feel like they were really participating, and they were really participating in decision making. Later on, we would do different things and add aspects to the model, like having caucuses, women's caucus, people of color caucus, maybe people with disabilities caucus, elder people caucuses, which allowed different privileges and different ways for communities that suffered traditional forms of oppression to have more voice in those meetings, or to have voice when they felt like their voice was necessary around particular issues that were coming up, particularly where people might have blind spots. So there were different ways that we tried to work with the structure to find more and better ways to prefigure our politics throughout the years.